last emperor of Brazil died quietly in exile, here, in this Parisian hotel, on a cold winter evening, far away from his beloved homeland. The few family and friends that followed him held a quiet vigil at his bedside. Above the soft weeping, one could clearly hear the old king whispering the name of the country that sent him away over and over again. Who was this last emperor of Brazil? Why did his country turn him away? A former colony of Portugal, by the 1860s, Brazil was a growing, bustling, independent country. The large natural port in Rio de Janeiro made it a center for world commerce, trade, and above all, profits. The country was wide open. There were riches to be made, silver and gold to be mined, sugar to be grown, harvested, refined, and exported. And it was Brazil's thriving slave trade that made all that wealth possible. The country quickly transformed from a jungle into an impressive European oasis at the entrance to the mysterious Amazon. The elite wore the latest European fashions. The streets were alive with people. Merchants, tradesmen, street vendors. The upper classes traveled in comfort, as they always do. Brazil opened its doors to European immigration, and they came in droves, hoping for adventure, intrigue, or perhaps to escape the never-ending European wars. New technologies and inventions were quickly reshaping the land, but that prosperity would soon be challenged. Talk of war filled the air. Border disputes between other emerging South American nations threatened to escalate military tensions between them. In late 1864, Paraguay invaded Uruguay. In 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay formed the Triple Alliance, and together they declared war on Paraguay.
The war begins at midnight.
And thus began one of the bloodiest wars in South American history. On land, On the waterways, through jungle heat and torrential storms, the carnage would go on to kill 2/3 of all the men of Paraguay. It would take them decades to recover. In a recently discovered film interview, meticulously restored by film experts, the emperor can be seen and heard for the first time reflecting on the war, on his family, on his daily life as a monarch, and his ambitious plans for his beloved Brazil. Let's hear what he has to say.
I didn't start this war. I'm not an expansionist. This war was initiated by one man, Francisco Solano Lopez. Drunk on power.
I will show Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay what real men are made of. Power corrupts every man who gets the slightest whiff of it.
True, true. Lamentably, I was in fact born to power, but that was not my doing. I'm a family man. This is my family. Those are my daughters and their husbands. Good lads, fine young men. Both cursed, like I am, with a royal pedigree. They provide some relief and worry. My daughter Isabel is next in line to the throne.
Why do you doubt my leadership, Father? You've taught me well.
But Brazilians will never accept a woman as ruler. This troubles me. I've been surrounded by people seeking power since I was born. I'd much rather spend my time reading, translating the classics. I've always found comfort in books, poems, novels. I have so little time for my studies from my formal duties. I meet the people, I let them see me. I do like seeing them. They are so kind. I attend to boring political dramas, meet with diplomats and such, fancy dinners and all that. I sit through many bored to tears. But it's always good to just sit back with an engrossing book. There are happy, joyous times, to be sure. I go to many parties. Then once this war is over, then perhaps I can focus on more important internal matters. Solano Lopez can't hold out much longer. Brazil has a long way to go. And we've come a long way since I became emperor when I was just a boy of 15. Brazil will see better tomorrows. I'll see to that.
Pedro II was born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on December 2nd, 1825. His official name was Dom Pedro de Alcântara João, Carlos Leopoldo Salvador Bibiano, Francisco Xavier de Paula Leocadio, Miguel Gabriel Rafael Gonzaga de Braganca y Borbón. But we'll just call him Dom Pedro II. His pedigree was impeccable, coming from a long, illustrious line of European kings and queens. His father, Pedro I, descended from the Portuguese house of Braganza. He was born in Brazil to his father, the King of Portugal, who had earlier fled after Napoleon invaded his country. Pedro I had a lust for life. He was into the high life we typically associate with billionaires. He wanted more of everything. Pedro II's mother, Maria Leopoldina, came from the Austrian Habsburg family. Pedro II also had two older sisters, Princesses Francisca and Princess Januaria. Like Pedro II, they would both be married off at young ages to European princes in order to maintain royal bloodlines and strengthen political alliances. Pedro's mother was a deeply religious and slavishly obedient woman who put on a brave face amidst her husband's many open love affairs. She endured her pain and shame in complete silence. Tragedy struck when she died on December 11th, 1826, of fever after a miscarriage. Pedro II has no memories of his mother. Pedro I wasted no time finding a new wife. She was stunningly beautiful. Young Pedro bonded well with his stepmother, the French princess Amélie Auguste Eugénie Napoléon de Leuchtenberg. By all accounts, she was as charming as she was beautiful and vivacious. Pedro has fond memories of his stepmother.
She was an amazing, amazing woman. I wish I had spent more time with her as a boy.
They might have lived a blissful existence as a family together in Brazil had not fate intervened. Pedro I would have to return to Portugal to reclaim his crown as king after the defeat of Napoleon. He and Amélie would leave Pedro II and his sisters behind. Pedro would become the second emperor of Brazil once he came of age. A sad, tearful Pedro would not see his father alive again. He would not see Amélie again until 1871. He learned early on that he was the most important person in all of Brazil. But he had no close friends. He was kept from interacting with his subjects. He had private tutors who instructed him in the fine arts, literature, history, and foreign languages, at which young Pedro was quite adept. The young boy king had a lonely childhood. He was close to his sisters, but they did not carry the burden of ruling on their shoulders. Pedro remembers,
I plunged myself into my duties as my father would have wished.
he knew he was not an ordinary boy. He escaped into the world of books, reading everything he could get his hands on. He swore he would devote himself to the best service of his country, even though he would later admit
I would rather have been a university scholar.
political pressure in Brazil mounted to install young Pedro as king as soon as possible. And so, at the age of 15, he was declared of age and crowned as the second emperor of Brazil. No sooner was he crowned that work immediately began on finding the new king a wife. He must immediately begin producing an heir. Negotiations in Europe commenced, and after months of intense searching, a suitable bride was found for the young emperor, Teresa Cristina of the Two Sicilies, an Italian princess with a pedigree from the House of Bourbon. She wasn't considered a great catch, but she was compliant, available, and there were only so many princesses to go around at the time. She sent Pedro II her portrait, and he sent her his. Until they met in person, they only had these paintings to go on. It would take many weeks for a painting to get from Brazil to Europe, and from Europe back to Brazil. Ships could be lost at sea, and their cargo stolen by pirates or end up at the ocean floor. Not surprisingly, when the two nuptials met for the first time aboard a sail ship anchored in Rio de Janeiro, hearts were broken.
Christina was not what I had in mind for a wife. I had a different image of her from the painting they sent me. I'm sure she was equally horrified when she first laid eyes on me.
But worse than that, much to his horror, he discovered she walked with a slight limp. It was not a fortuitous start to their marriage.
I was never a beauty. Pedro never found me attractive, but we learned to accept our limitations and move on.
Even at their wedding, it was clear they were not the happy, blissful couple. The tension was there for all to see, but they performed their duty with the staunch stubbornness tradition demands of them. They must play their part in the roles they were fated. After the celebrations and festivities wound down, it was time for the newlyweds to immediately get to work on producing a male heir. There was no time to waste. The wait for an heir took several months. There were fears the couple were having difficulties, but at long last, the first of 4 children was born. A boy, Afonso, a male heir. Isabel came next, followed by Leopoldina, and lastly, Pedro III. The royal family settled into a life of stately living. These were happy times for Pedro. Then tragedy struck. Alonso, then Pedro III, died. Both did not make it past the age of 2. Devastated by these crushing blows, Pedro II resigned himself to having no male heir to the throne, a foreboding set in that he may well be the last emperor of Brazil. And so quickly he set about negotiating the marriage of his eldest daughter, Isabel, as others had done for him. A suitable match was eventually found in France. His name was Prince Gaston of Orléans, Count of Eu. He was an ambitious young man who had seen some military action in the Hispano-Moroccan War of 1859. He knew he would be seen in Brazil as a French foreigner, not a native-born citizen. He would never be king. His relationship with Pedro was warm, but frosty. Dom Pedro never permitted himself to be too close to anyone, not even with his own family. With his military experience in Morocco, Prince Gaston begged for the opportunity to fight Paraguay. This made him popular with the Brazilians. He briefly joined as an officer on the front lines and played his part in the war effort. As the war with Paraguay came to close in 1870, the Triple Alliance emerged victorious over Solano Lopez. After the celebrations and speeches were over, Pedro could now focus on his family. There was also the pressing problem of slavery and the building of his legacy as the philosopher king of the Americas. He would soon achieve worldwide fame and glory on the world stage as the 19th century gave way to the dawn of the new century and the modern world. Slavery took root in Brazil almost as soon as it was discovered by Portuguese explorers. Some 80% of the transatlantic slave trade was ultimately destined for Brazil. It was a brutal but lucrative trade. Extracting the wealth from the fields, the mines, the factories required a never-ending supply of forced labor. And although Brazil pledged to end the transatlantic slave trade in exchange for its independence, the slave trade continued unabated. The government turned a blind eye. There were sporadic, violent, and often bloody slave uprisings in some of the provinces, but they were quickly put down with brute force. There was never a popular abolitionist movement in Brazil, as there was in America and England. But Brazil could not exist without slavery, or so it was thought. So entrenched was slavery that in Brazil, even slaves had slaves. But international pressure and the recent emancipation of the slaves in the United States left Brazil as the only country in the Americas still practicing slavery, and the only country in the Americas with a king. Pedro owned no slaves of his own, but his entire existence was made possible by their work. Meanwhile, Pedro embarked on a wide array of public improvements and reforms. Culture became more refined and modernized. Public spaces were added. These were the golden years for Brazil, when Pedro reached the apex of power influence, and fame. Things were going so well, Pedro decided to risk a trip abroad, embarking on his very first world tour. Sailing on the newly commissioned Brazilian steamship, Afonso, named after his late son, Pedro and his wife sailed for the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in the United States. There, he would meet President Ulysses Grant, switch on the largest electric dynamo in the world, and meet Alexander Graham Bell. Then, it was off to Europe. There he would see London, Paris, Rome, Russia. He even managed to go to Egypt, where he toured the pyramids of Giza, among other great wonders. He would go on to meet and develop relationships with international luminaries such as Louis Pasteur, Friedrich Nietzsche, Charles Darwin, and many others. Perhaps no one spoke more glowingly of the Brazilian emperor than Victor Hugo, the great French author of the classics, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Les Miserables.
He has Marcus Aurelius as his ancestor. That is certain.
Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman emperor, is considered by many historians to have been the world's last philosopher king. Pedro II, thus, came to embody the Socratic ideal of the best possible ruler, a man of reason, strong, wise, just, and merciful. Upon his return from his year-long voyage, he was greeted by rapturous crowds, happy to see their king return. He immediately returned to the business of running his country. His push for the abolition of slavery had been stalled for years in Congress, ever since the war with Paraguay ended in 1870. Political debates simply dragged on. The various classes and factions plotted, one against the other. There was also a rising call to replace the monarchy with a Brazilian republic. It was an idea spreading rapidly, especially among Brazil's business leaders and the educated elites. The monarchy was seen, by the late 1880s, as a relic of the past. The emperor himself was seen as becoming too old, too feeble, to lead Brazil into the future. By 1887, Pedro, now 62 years of age, fell ill. It was recommended that he travel to Europe to seek better medical attention and to take his mind off the daily grind of his royal duties and the battles with the Brazilian cabinet. On May 8, 1888, while Pedro was in Vienna, to nearly everyone's surprise, the Brazilian ministry introduced a bill abolishing slavery without condition. The bill was quickly pushed through the legislature, and on May 13, 1888, the bill was signed into law. The demand for the abolition of slavery in Brazil had not arisen organically. The abolition of slavery in Brazil was driven by the personal desires of one man, Pedro II. To modern sensibilities, Pedro II is an enigma, a socially progressive ruler who nonetheless embodies the finer aspects of a genteel, conservative monarchist. Such a man could not exist in today's world. Upon his return from Europe in August of 1888, Pedro was once again enthusiastically greeted by his adoring subjects. But it was soon evident something had changed while Pedro was away. Brazil had changed, and this change would bring about the beginning of the end for Pedro II and his kingdom. This is Field Marshal Teodoro da Fonseca, a hero of the Paraguayan War. Da Fonseca was named the first president of the newly established Republic of Brazil on November 15, 1889. By the end of the 19th century, the power and influence of monarchies throughout the world was rapidly eroding. This trend had been growing since the French Revolution. In Brazil, the idea took root among the elites and military men that the monarchy stood in the way of progress, whatever progress was, and the time had now come for Pedro to step aside. The Kingdom of Brazil would be rebranded, reconstituted, rebuilt as the Republic of Brazil. This transition happened swiftly. On November 15th, 1889, a cabal of military and political players arrived at the emperor's palace and informed him it was all over. He had to leave immediately. Field Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca was now in charge. In a flurry of activity, the royal family hurriedly packed what few items they could take with them. They had no idea where they were going or what would happen next. Pedro took the news calmly. Despite pleadings from his son-in-law to organize an armed resistance to the insurrection, Pedro refused to maintain his grip on power. He would offer no resistance. He would have no bloodshed in his name. Since the death of his two sons, he had a premonition his kingdom would end with him. Those premonitions now proved to be true. Under cover of darkness and military escort, the emperor and his family were hurried aboard the steamer Gironde and sent into exile. Pedro would never see his beloved Brazil again. While in exile, Pedro continued traveling throughout Europe extensively. Sadly, in December of 1889, his devoted wife, Teresa Cristina, died in Portugal. Pedro II would spend the rest of his life speaking of her as a saint. Pedro himself would succumb to pneumonia 2 years later at the Hotel Bedford in Paris, France, on December 5, 1891. His funeral was attended by kings, queens, scientists, diplomats from the world over, and hundreds of thousands of admirers. It wasn't until the 1920s that his body, along with that of Teresa Cristina, was returned to Brazil. It wasn't until then that Brazil was finally ready to bury its imperial past and move on into the modern world. Today, in the 1950s, Brazil is a modern country, with all the modern conveniences we have in America today. Its people have worked hard to forge a new identity as a democracy. None of this would have been possible without the leadership, decision-making, and guidance of Pedro II, the shepherd of his people. He was called Pedro the Magnanimous by the crowds, and today you can visit his magnificent mausoleum where he rests, alongside Teresa Cristina, his daughter Isabel, and her husband, Prince Gaston of Orleans. Few outside Brazil remember this extraordinary man and his extraordinary times. Now that you know his story, you can make sure that the story of the last emperor of Brazil continues to be told for generations to come. Thank you for watching. I've been your host, Dan Carrington. Good night, and here's to better tomorrows.